Hey guys, in this video, we will be discussing Xiao's power level compared to other main DPS at C0. When determining Xiao's power level, we must consider two different approaches. We must compare theoretical numbers and actual practicality of those numbers for the average player. Theoretical numbers often look at the damage ceiling of a character based on calculations. On the other hand, gameplay can help determine the effectiveness of reaching those calculated numbers. We should also be careful of the illusion Xiao brings to the table, which is how the high numbers from a single attack doesn't necessarily mean he is overpowered, because when Xiao is in his burst, he hurts the damage of his other supports by taking up all the screen time, unlike say a Ganyu, Diluc, or Ningguang, who allow for supports to pop their skills off cooldown. I'd like to preface that due to where amplifying reactions sit in the current meta, I don't see Melt Ganyu being overtaken by Xiao at C0. This is also true when we compare Ganyu's motion values of her charge attack combo and Xiao's most optimal combo, N1CJP or Jet motion values per second. Through this comparison, we see Ganyu doing vastly more damage, excluding her burst and supports. When we factor in her elemental burst and supports, Ganyu surpasses Xiao in most aspects. In addition, Freeze Ganyu requires less investment, team preparation compared to optimizing a team for Xiao, and doesn't necessarily have issues of uptime and downtime, meaning that Ganyu can hit higher numbers than Xiao on both builds at C0. We will now move on to Xiao versus Diluc. Diluc is a 5-star Pyro Claymore user and is primarily used in vaporized team compositions, normally with a Xingqiu for consistent vapes. Unlike Diluc, Xiao is not reaction focused, meaning most of his potential damage is shown to us immediately as a Nemo damage without the need for setup. In terms of reaction comparison, Xiao's Swirl does provide some benefits such as extra damage, maintaining certain auras on enemies, and spreading elemental auras. However, it's nowhere near the effectiveness of Melt and Vaporize. We also need to note that unlike Diluc and Ganyu, Xiao gains a majority of his damage from his elemental burst, which poses the issue of consistency of damage. A key difference between Diluc and Xiao would be that it's much harder to optimize supports around Xiao, and there's no clear-cut best supports as everything is situational. Now, on the upside, we can use Xiao as a team 2 for a team 1 that has Diluc, Klee, Electrocharge Cutsing, and Freeze Ganyu, as they all fight for Xingqiu on the team. So having another DPS that doesn't necessarily require a Xingqiu would be nice. For Diluc, you could honestly just run Diluc plus Xingqiu and a damage amplifier, a healer, and you're pretty much set. Another thing to note is that we can run Diluc with no healers in his team and primarily focus on damage, which we can't necessarily do with Xiao in our party. On the other hand, since Xiao's playstyle is more selfish than Diluc, we generally want to have our supports use on-field skills like Facial E or Albedo E. Now that we have discussed the differences between the two, I'd like to move on to my main point, which is, in a theoretical perspective, Xiao can rival the damage of vaporized Diluc. However, this is based on the assumptions that we use frame-perfect inputs, such as using the exact frame where low plunge becomes a high plunge. We don't factor in environmental changes like domains and abyss auras inflicting statuses, and other non-ideal conditions. Xiao faces the problem Klee faced when she first released, which was the practicality of performing certain combos. Like Klee's jump cancel and animation cancel in general, believe it or not, Xiao does have micromanagement components if we want to optimize and reach the theoretical values calculated to compete with Diluc. An example of this would be the combo I stated earlier, N1CJP, also known as Jet. So N1CJP involves a normal attack 1, followed by a charge attack animation cancel, preceded by a jump cancel into a high plunge. In terms of numbers, if we use Zakharov's calculations, Zakharov is a theory crafter in the Cutsing mains community, where he calculates the comparison between different main DPS. In terms of numbers, if we use Zakharov's calculations, where he assumes ideal scenarios mentioned, including 100% burst uptime plus attack sands, This is important as we assume Xiao is doing 2 rotation max wipes, so he doesn't necessarily need to add any more ERA percent other than the assumed 130% on the sheet made by Zach. So, in Zakharov's calculations, Xiao falls short at 14k DPS for a single target compared to Diluc's 15k at C0. We can also see how in terms of AoE, Xiao can keep up with 22k DPS versus Diluc's 24k DPS. This is already factoring in Vape Diluc and comparing them at Wolf Gravestone versus Primordial Jade Wing Spear. If we look at different weapons that aren't 5-star, Xiao actually overtakes Vape Diluc in single target when comparing Deathmatch versus Serpent Spine, and just 300 DPS behind in the 4-star AoE comparison between Xiao versus Vape Diluc. Now, I'd like to mention how we should process these numbers and to what extent are they accurate. Yes, Xiao overtakes Diluc in some scenarios of comparison. However, this is assuming we play him with frame-perfect precision. I would like to add that in these calculations, the Diluc Vape portion does not include Xingqiu's damage, rather just the consistent aura. This means that in a team's perspective, Diluc's team could potentially be dealing more damage because of support flexibility. On the contrary, Xiao can also have turrets on his own, such as Albedo's E-proc. However, that begins to involve a whole nother set of stats and constellations to mess around with, which would be too difficult to factor in. All things considered, we need to be playing Xiao nearly frame perfect in order for us to overtake Diluc in terms of damage. Knowing how brain dead aka easy to play Diluc is, we have a much easier time hitting those theoretical values compared to Xiao. Thus, at that point, Diluc overtakes Xiao, and that occurs in most cases for the average player. On a side note, Xiao does seem like he can outdamage Vape Klee and Kutzing. However, again, the argument of how effective we can reach those theoretical values for Klee or Xiao still remain. We will now move on to the discussion, the damage differences between Plunge Spam and N1CJP or Jet. We need to know this because in the most optimal scenario, we are using N1CJP for calculations, and finding out the differences allows us to grasp how far the theoretical is from the practical. We will now discuss the frame data of N1CJP versus the high plunge spam and how effective or how realistic we can actually get those values. So in here, I have split these frame tests in 2 scenarios. The first one is perfect frame and the other one is the boomer version. So the perfect frame is essentially perfect frames, and the boomer version has like the average player input lag and how the average player doesn't necessarily have the best reaction time. So for N1CJP, we have 115 frames, but the boomer version of that would be 120 frames. For the high plunge, we have 75 frames, while the boomer version of that would be 80 frames. Now, when we compare the most optimal scenarios for both N1CJP or Jet versus the high plunge, we see a 5% increase in damage when we use Jet. Now, when we compare the Jet perfect scenario versus the boomer version of high plunge, we see a 12% increase in damage. When we compare the boomer version of Jet versus the most optimal frame scenario of high plunge, we see that Jet still has a 2.38% increase in damage, meaning that at worst case scenario, we are still doing more damage with N1CJP or Jet, meaning that we should always be performing N1CJP whenever we can, unless it's an AoE scenario such as floor 12-1. A quick TLDR of that would be N1CJP or Jet being the best and most optimal combo, and the disparity between frame perfect N1CJP versus high plunge is as follows. Now, overall, Xiao is an extremely good character as he can compete with other top tier DPS options. He excels in AoE primarily based on gameplay in Abyss, and I feel Xiao's AoE capabilities are better than Diluc's as his plunge affects a wide radius, bypasses shields, staggers units, and breaks geo shields relatively quickly. This is compared to Diluc's cone-shaped AoE, where it doesn't necessarily affect units, which surrounds him, and which requires him to reposition to hit all enemies. In terms of comparison for Diluc versus Xiao, it's very much dependent on what weapons they are using, and how effective we can reach those theoretical values, so meaning your gameplay. But overall, they should be relatively close to one another as shown on the sheets, and based on frame perfect and non-frame perfect inputs, we can also see that the total damage difference between them is around 12% for less optimal to most optimal. To sum that portion up even more, Ganyu Freeze, Ganyu Melt, Diluc Vape are stronger than Xiao. However, in practice of AoE scenarios, Xiao can potentially beat out Diluc based on Abyss testing. But overall, Diluc is still better for single target to a small degree. Though, I will note, Geo DPS are looking considerably strong compared to these existing high tier DPS. These include Ningguang, Burst Support Albedo, and Zhongli's utility. As we are still into early 1.3, there are no comparisons yet between Xiao and other Geo units. But I'm more than certain we will see a lot more usage of Geo focus teams in the future. So that wraps up the video. Essentially, Ganyu Freeze, Ganyu Melt, Diluc Vape are stronger than Xiao, but then Xiao overtakes Diluc in some scenarios. Those scenarios include frame perfect inputs, and if Xiao is dealing with a larger AoE which Diluc cannot handle. Now, if you are considering pulling for Xiao, you need to ask yourself if you have the supports to help him, as based on like how he plays out, he isn't really F2P friendly. And so if you have a Xingqiu and a Diluc for Team 1, or a cutscene Xingqiu, Xiao not needing a Xingqiu could be a good investment. I wouldn't really push for C1 or C2 at the moment because of its price tag, but I will discuss this in a future video and when each constellation's value increases or decreases. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoy and learn something new, and I'll be discussing more Xiao stuff in the future. Take care.